I wanted to share with you a little bit about a right that you have. It is indeed a right, however, you have not been informed of this right, as you should have been. There was an obligation upon Canada to inform you, and they have failed. The Constitution Act of Canada, 1982, Article 3. Every citizen of Canada has the right to vote in an election of members of the House of Commons or of a legislative assembly and to be qualified for membership therein. We're looking in the Constitution Act of Canada, 1982, Article 3. It states that every citizen has a right to vote. Now, that citizen, who is the subject, the player that's being spoken about here, has been granted a right. That right is to vote. Now, as I shared with you or expressed last time, I tried to bring this forward, is that having a right does not produce an obligation. The Canadian citizen has a right to vote, yet come election time, no one will force that Canadian citizen to operate that right or to use that right. They want you to vote, they encourage you to vote as a Canadian citizen, but you're not forced. Having a right is something that you can do, you can exercise. But having a right creates no obligation. No obligation. So you have to keep that in mind. Whenever you hear or you read or you study and the sentence says everyone has a right to, everyone has a right to, this means that it's something that can be exercised. There is something there for you to stand upon, to exercise if you choose, but it's not producing an obligation. So just like we're looking here, that every citizen has a right to vote, we're going to look at a couple of other rights that we have enumerated and listed. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 23. Everyone has the right to work, to free choice of employment, to just and favorable conditions of work, and to protection against unemployment. The International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, Article 6. The states, parties to the present covenant, recognize the right to work, which includes the right of everyone to the opportunity to gain his living by work which he freely chooses or accepts, and will take appropriate steps to safeguard this right. We're looking into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 23. Although this is not legally binding upon the state parties, such as Canada and America, however, subsequently, they introduced or they brought forth the international covenants, and the same expressions of law that were in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are now found in the international covenants, and these international covenants, they are binding upon the state parties. They are binding upon Canada and upon America. Now, when you look at Article 23, you see that it states, everyone has a right to work and to free choice of employment. Now, in Article 6 of the International Covenant, you see that it writes that the state party recognizes the right to work, which includes the right of everyone to the opportunity to gain his living by work, which he freely chooses or accepts to do. Now notice that when they're talking about work, they present it as a right. They say everyone has the right to work. Okay? So this sentence here, the construction of this sentence is not producing an obligation. This is producing an option, a choice. Everyone, a human being, a man or a woman, even a citizen, if you will, has a right to work. It's a choice you can do. And in the International Covenant, we see the same operation of law. The state parties recognize the right to work. Now I want to draw your attention, focus down a little bit more here. Notice what it says, the right to work which includes. Now notice that word. For all of those who follow my videos, they're going to understand and they're going to catch this, that what they're about to define is closing off the definition of work for this law. So which includes the right of everyone to the opportunity to gain his living by work. Okay? This is what it's saying. That work, it means that it's an opportunity for you to go out there and to gain a living. To gain your living by work. Now my question to you guys, my question to those who watch my video is, how do you gain your living? Is there only one medium, one way for an individual, for a human being to gain a living? And is that to go out and work? If that's the case, then they wouldn't be presenting an option. It wouldn't be a right, it would be an obligation. It would be such as the fact everyone must work in order to gain his living. Everyone must work in order to gain his living. But that's not what's presented here. What is presented is an option. What is presented is a choice. And they are saying everyone has a right to work, and if they choose to work, if they accept to work, the reasons for working is to go about and gain your living by doing this work. So, if you choose to work, for example, then the obligations that Canada would have to you towards making sure that you as a human being had a secured living would now be codified. It would be over. Their obligations would fall to the side. Why? Because you freely chose and freely accepted to go after and to pursue or to gain a living through the medium avenue called work. Where, if you look into the international covenants, Canada has an obligation to you as an individual to make sure that you have a secured living apart from work. The International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, Article 11. This states, parties to the present covenant recognize the right of everyone to an adequate standard of living for himself and his family, including adequate food, clothing, and housing, and to the continuous improvement of living conditions. So as you see, we are all given a right, and this right is the right to work. Now, as you also saw, they qualify, they designate, they term, they describe what working is, what is the object of working, and what you are doing while you are working. They say that if you choose and you accept to work, the object of that work is to gain a living. That's the object. So, you cannot say, I'm going out to work in order for me to save money, in order that I may entertain myself, for example. I'm going to work in order to produce enough dollar bills to go on a tour across all of the world because I want to see different cities. That's not what the reason for working is. The reason that the state parties, Canada, America, and the International Covenant states, the reason for working is to gain your living. To gain your living. Now, as a human being, you also have a right. You have a right to enjoy a living and not gain a living. Two different operations that are going on. And when you are enjoying a living, you are in the pursuit of happiness. In the pursuit of happiness. Now look, it states that in Article 11, in the International Covenant, that everyone has a right to adequate standard of living. There's that same word again, living. So here, you're gaining a living with what you do by choosing to work. Okay? But as a human being, you have another right, you have another guarantee for you, and that is the right to an adequate standard of living. Okay? And then they list it. They use the word including. And they say including food, clothing, housing, and the continued improvement of living conditions. That is a right that you have. And you can enjoy that right, you can enjoy that living without having to gain that living through work. Now, they use that word including because the list here of food, clothing, housing is not closed. There's other articles, there's other things that can be added to this list. That's why it's left open using the word including. However, when we go back and it talks about what work is and defines what work is, they use the word only includes. So they close off the word, the definition. They say work is for the gaining of your living. So you couldn't have a job, you couldn't go out there and get work and then go to the government and say, well, I have another right. And that other right is an obligation upon you. And I have the right to enjoy a living and to pursue happiness. And in that right of enjoying a living, I'm entitled to an adequate standard of living, which you must provide for me. Food, clothing, and housing. They would say, no, there's no more obligation, because you freely chose and freely accepted to work, and by doing so, you went out to gain that living. Now, I have no more obligation for you to make sure that you have a standard of living that's adequate for you. And that's the trick that they are playing with us. They are teaching us, when we are young, that we have an obligation to work. Not only that, the social systems in Canada that supports that artificial person, the Canadian citizen, the legal entity, the social systems are way under way under our fundamental human rights and freedoms. You see, if we were not to work today, for example, if you are in health and you can hold a job, and you decided not to work, and you're not aware of your fundamental human rights and freedoms, you'd have to go to a social system such as welfare, and the money that they give to the artificial person, that Canadian citizen, does not entitle you, does not give you enough, if you will say, monetary backing to have adequate food month after month, to adequately clothe yourself, to have a decent apartment and keep yourself heated, and to the continued improvement of that living condition. Those social systems fall way short, but they're under no obligation anymore in those social systems to respect these rights. Why? Because when you went out and you exercised this right to work here, and you said, I'm going to exercise as a human being my right to work to gain my living, you removed the obligation against the state party, Canada or America, concerning all this. Because you went out to earn or pursue your living. However, if you stand under your fundamental rights and claim that you have the right to enjoy the economic and social rights that are enumerated, not to pursue after them, there places an obligation upon Canada. And that's where the security of your person comes in. A lot of people hear about the security of the person. That's what this is all about here. When you are choosing not to work and don't exercise that right to work to gain that living, therefore there has to be a security in place from the resources of Canada to secure your fundamental human rights and freedoms. Every citizen has that right to vote, and having a right does not produce an obligation. Okay? Everyone, we have a right to work. Again, having that right doesn't produce the obligation, but we have a right to work. And if we freely choose and accept to work, then what we are doing when we are working, they use the word includes to close off the definition. It means we have chosen now to gain a living. To gain a living. And the security of the person that was supposed to be there for us if we were not gaining a living, now we are not having access to it because we freely chose and accepted to gain a living instead of enjoy our living. So when you work, you gain your living, and they say you freely chose to accept and to do this. Now, as in everyone, you have another right. You have a right to a standard of living or to a living, and they enumerate it. They say including. They leave the definition open, including food, clothing, house, and the continued improvement of your living condition. So you can choose to exercise this right, the right to work, and to earn or gain your living, pursue after it, or you can choose to exercise this right, which places the state party, Canada, under obligation towards you, to make sure that you have a living, adequate living, including food, clothing, housing, and the continued improvement of your living condition. That's an obligation. Now, we are taught, again, from when we are young, the only option, the only availability to us here in Canada is that we have to work. And they make the social systems so horrible that if you choose not to work, as that citizen, you're left in poverty. You don't have enough food, clothing, and housing. However, if, as in everyone, as a human being, you exercise your fundamental right and you choose not to work, and you choose not to exercise this right to work, and not to earn or gain that living, then the obligations that Canada is a signatory to, the international covenants, falls upon them. And you can launch a challenge against them saying that I cannot pursue happiness, I cannot have a happy living because of the fact my rights are being removed from me, and they are trying to force me to operate only under this way. And that's an illegal action upon Canada's behalf. They don't have a right to do that to you. That's breaking the covenant obligation. The state parties, Canada included, they had an obligation. Remember, we've seen it in other videos. They had an obligation to make sure that these rights and freedoms, including the one that I just shared with you today, were expressed in the constitutional process of our country, or they were allowed to operate through other measures. Canada could use other measures to make sure that our rights and freedoms were expressed and were allowed to operate. They have to give effect to these rights. So the question now comes in, if I choose not to work as defined in domestic law and international law, if I choose not to earn and pursue after a living, how is the measure, or where is the measure available for me to enjoy my living, to enjoy my civil and political rights, to enjoy my economic, social and cultural rights, instead of having to earn and pursue them? Canada was under obligation to produce this measure. If they didn't, they would automatically fall into default. They did produce the measure. It's available. It's in operation in Canada. It's just well hidden. First, it takes us to understand the difference between the right to work and the obligation, such as we've been taught since we've been young.